And so when anyone likes to come at me, your favorite heretic, when they like to come at me and say, well, the church or the Bible says this, I like to point out just how queer and how progressive and diverse church history is.
Hi, my name's leowt, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome.
What's up, friends? It's leowt here with a special edition of Conversations that's actually my final project for the history of Christian thought. But I wanted to share some cool information with you folks, as well as getting out some of the information that I learned in my class. One of the things that's really insanely interesting to me about church history is the assertion of a singular or a unified church. I feel like that's something that is kind of a commonplace in American mindset, is that, Christians believe one thing. And it's not even that I don't think that that's true. It's actually just not true. I've been studying a discipline called Queer Theology, just scratching the surface of it recently. But the idea behind Queer Theology is that it's not just about orientation and gender. It's about breaking down and disestablishing binary boundaries. So some binary thought would be for example, male and female. But non-binary thought or queer thought understands that male and female are ends of a spectrum. And I think that that's something that's really important to note when we're talking about church history, is that church history is actually, in many senses, very queer. Stick with me here. I will show you this, right? I'm going to show you this in a conversation that takes us from about the 13th century to the 16th century. I'm going to be talking in and around the idea of the Protestant Reformation, Catholic Counter-Reformation, and we're going to start with a little bit of sort of mysticism that's not really talked about. People want to say that the church is this or the church is that, but the reality is that the history of the church is very queer, and it is one of protest. There were many, many diverse bodies of people that came about to protest the ways in which they saw the church or society going astray. There are many, many communities that came out as completely unique communities that had specific purposes that were oftentimes labeled heretical. This is where you see my interest in the topic because, for a while I actually considered naming this podcast My Favorite Heretic, Leo Walters Tahara. But instead, I went with Conversations. It seemed accessible. But the first community of people that were, in fact, very much a part of queer church history is the Beguines. They existed in the 13th century in Belgium and the Netherlands, roughly. There's always some far-flung people, but that's where the movement originated. It's important that you note that they were female lay people who took it upon themselves to lead a life of piety. They weren't nuns. They were typically aristocrats, actually, and they were autonomous, meaning they had no one who was controlling them. They were this community that sprang up of female mystics and scholars, and my favorite thing about them is they really pushed the boundaries of church theology. They pushed up on the edges of what people thought. Some of what they did was actually quite remarkable and would still be considered progressive to this day. The Beguines were characterized by focusing on education in the public, especially of children and women. They provided aid to sex workers, they tended to the sick, and they lived in intentional community. Which actually sounds like not a bad idea that I might like to revive now. But the thing that I want to point out is that they were queering church history by going beyond the binary of sacred and secular. or real life and church life. They intermixed it all. They gave their whole lives to do this work, and they hung out with sex workers, illiterate women and children, and the sick. And I think that's kind of one of the best examples of queering what church is and what church does, especially in the 13th century. You can't understate how unique that was at that time period. It was the existence of autonomous and powerful, influential communities of women was unheard of in the 13th century. So one of the Beguines was Haybitch of Antwerp. She believed that God is love, and that love is the ground of all being. Love in and of itself is the most important reason for existence. And what I really love, right? So the Beguines were queer. Hadewijch was super queer, right? There's actually artwork and literature from her where she took on the role of the knight in shining armor, and Jesus was the object of her love. And so in that manner, she queered the narrative of Jesus coming to save her, and she was the knight in shining armor fighting to get to the ultimate like example of love in Jesus. So y'all know I love a good queer project. So Hadewijch of Antwerp, super, whether or not anybody else wants to call it that, a super queer figure in church history. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is the Protestant Reformation. It's really important to understand the Reformations because we're talking about the closest touch point in church history in terms of the systems of church that we have now. Like this, in my opinion, which is just my opinion. Like I don't have my PhD in biblical scholarship, but this idea of the Protestant Reformation and the splits between the Protestants and the Catholics and the Anglicans and that really set up the system that we recognize as the church today, right? So basically there was the Catholic Church. It was like all encompassing. And then that was like the main church of the day. But there was a certain group of people, right, who would become what we know as Protestants, coming from the word protest, right? And they disagreed with a lot of stuff that was happening in the church at the time. One of them was the buying and selling of relics and you know, like religious items and such like that, and holy rites. They were trying to monetize, right, spirituality. And this dude Martin Luther comes around. He's got a paper. It's got 95 theses on it, and he's nailing it to the door of the Catholic Church in Wittenberg, Germany. And Martin Luther is who we commonly talk of as the Protestant that started the Protestant Revolution of his day. His main ideas were that of salvation by faith, not by works. So by faith alone, biblical authority over that of church tradition, and priesthood of all believers. Martin Luther believed in public education and literacy, and that played out in how he viewed spirituality and how the church should function. This was countercultural at the time to some of the things that were happening within the Catholic Church. And so Martin Luther took and he nailed these 95 statements on the door and said, like, you need to fix this, church. And then from there, we started to see this split off between Protestantism and Catholicism. There's other people that were central in the terms of the Protestant Reformation, and one of the people that I'd also like to touch on is John Calvin. Important because there's still a branch of Christianity called Calvinism, and one of the things about Calvinism is, let me not jump ahead of myself. John Calvin, right? From France and Switzerland, that was like his home stomping grounds. And the three things that characterize John Calvin, fellow Protestant, but not the same beliefs as Luther, is John Calvin believed in salvation by faith, so we agree there. He believed in human depravity, so humans' complete inability to be anything without God. But also John Calvin believed in an idea called predestination, which is the idea that once like God created heaven and earth, God knew exactly who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell, and it was on God. Now, I can't quite vibe with that theology, and I'm not saying I've studied Calvinist theology extensively, but I am saying that the idea of predestination just seems like a weird flex for me, right? Like, how do you bring members in with that? I don't know. But those were some players in the Protestant Reformation. They basically said the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, there's things that are happening in there, and we need to create a change. And so then you start to see the split off of Protestant denominations. You also had other players, you had Martin Luther, you had John Calvin, but some other noteworthy players were the Tudors in England. That's where we see Henry VIII come in, who is, a lot of people talk about him as the reason for the split from the Catholic Church, but this was a little bit more drilled down, right? The Tudors of England, who, I would say the figure that captured them would be Henry VIII. Henry VIII wanted a divorce, which is a weird flex because he later executed his second wife for suspicions of treason. So I don't know what's going on with him. But what's really cool about that is the Tudors in England, Henry VIII, right? That family structure, that monarchy structure, led way to King Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth, being the head of both the country and the church. So that's an incredibly queer idea, especially, in 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century times, to have a woman be the head of a country and the head of the church. So that's where you see like the Anglican Church of England split off. Then you also had the Huguenots in France. They were a French Protestant religious minority, and they actually all ended up getting executed because they were saying, this is what's happening in the church and it's not okay. So you see these echoes of protest and desire to change the status quo, which I think is interesting because then you start to see the binary nature of the church dissolve even more. The next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit that kind of was there was a cause and effect relationship between the Protestant Reformation was the cause and the effect was the Catholic Counter-Reformation. This for me was something interesting because I grew up in a Protestant setting. And in my setting, I don't know how to put this any better, but in my setting, I was taught that Catholics were going to hell. That was what I was taught, and I've really enjoyed learning about the Catholic Church and the Catholic presence in overall church history, right? Because Catholic meant all, right? That was the church. And so in studying the Catholic Counter-Reformation, I was really interested because it had absolutely sprung up as a way to answer the Protestant Reformation. The hypothesis was that Protestantism and capitalism were connected. And so you start to see some sort of the queering of the boundaries even between church and economy, because the Catholic Church really saw these areas where Protestantism was taking hold and they were actually developing economically. So the Catholic Church was like, okay, we got to get a hold on our people, right? And we got to figure out what's going here economically because something is, we're missing something. And so they were seeking to kind of figure out the issues within Protestantism, but also how to create more wealth in the areas that were systemically underneath the thumb of the Catholic Church. The biggest thing that they were doing as an answer to the Protestants was trying to remove some of the corruption from within the ranks of the Catholic Church, and they also wanted to retain the loyalty of Catholics. And so the Catholics attempted to queer the geographic area where they were located as well, because they sent massive amounts of missionaries out all over the place trying to take Catholicism to new lands. But also, these sneaky little guys, these Catholic missionaries also brought back economic and trade secrets from the area that they went to and brought them back to their home areas. So you can see a little bit of the queering between the church and the economy there. For better or for worse, they were bringing stuff back. An example would be China used to make, in that time period, China made fine porcelain, and they brought some of those tips and tricks back so that porcelain could be made in their home area. It's really interesting to me that there's so much of a focus on the economic issue there, because it shows that the church and these reformational movements were really a part of all of life. Once again, another way where the boundary was queered between, church history and just history, as we like to call it. One of the major players of the Catholic counter-reform was Ignatius of Loyola. There are, if you're watching this, raise your hand. Just do it, it's funny. But raise your hand if you've heard of a school with the name of Loyola in it. This is because Ignatius had to counter what John Calvin and Martin Luther were saying, right? And they're talking about a priesthood of all saints. And here in the Catholic Church, the reading of the scripture and the giving of the sacraments and stuff, those were all reserved for the clergy and people within that hierarchy. And so with Protestants over here opening up a little bit and queering the boundaries between clergy and lay people, the Catholics are like, oh, we got to keep step with Calvin and Luther, right? We got to get on this. So Ignatius of Loyola actually founded the order of the Jesuits, and they began to kind of be this very active, I guess we'll call them an outreach branch of the Catholic Church. But they were focused on missionary work, charitable work, and this is the big one, education. They started to educate the general public so that the general public would have buy-in in the Catholic Church and not be swept away by the evil Protestants, those heretics. One of the biggest movements of that time of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was actually a council that happened in Trent in the year 1545. So what happened there was a bunch of Catholics got together, of course, hierarchical Catholics, not just your average day Catholics, but they set, three main tenets of the Council of Trent that were supposed to be reformational, but also, these are the things we're not going to budge on, right? So Martin Luther had his 95 Theses, and Martin Luther, the Protestant ideas were salvation by faith, not by works, biblical authority over that of tradition, and priesthood of all believers. So the Catholics countered at the Council of Trent by saying that the Pope's interpretation of the Bible was final. That was it. That was it. And church tradition and the Bible were of equal importance. So that's where you see that really strong connection to the methods and the modes of doing research of doing church within the Catholic Church. The other one of the other main points that really stood in contrast to the Protestants was the idea that you were saved by faith and by good works. So that was really important to the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And the reason that I say all of this, right, is to explain that there is a very, very queer story about how we get to the churches that we sit in and occupy today. And also, this is fairly recent in history. You know what I mean? 16th century, right? So anything else that has come after that is an even younger theology. There are denominations out there that are less than 100 years old. There are churches out there, there's a large amount of churches out there right now that do not subscribe to a denomination. And so when anyone likes to come at me, your favorite heretic, when they like to come at me and say, well, the church or the Bible says this, I like to point out just how queer and how progressive and diverse church history is. There is and has always been all sorts of different beliefs. There has been all sorts of scriptures, and there has been all sorts of ways to practice religion. So when people try to shut that down, when people try to limit and box in and stick things into a binary, they're actually completely disavowing church history, because the history of the church is in fact very queer. Thanks for listening to my thoughts on church history, friends. If you have any questions, drop them below. Give a like and subscribe, all the things you're supposed to say at the end of a video. But I appreciate your time and your energy, and I hope this explains a little bit about the very queer, very protest-oriented, very heretical history of the modern church.
This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.